Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is about maintenance basics. With me is the service manager for Stage Audio Works, Clua Jones. He will pop in every now and then and just say a couple of words. And everybody knows Nathan. He's been driving the webinar side from Stage Audio Works really hard to get the information out there. So for those of you who don't know Stage Audio Works, we're headquartered in Midrand. We have more than 20 years of industry experience, and we have an extensive in-house service center located in Midrand. The Source Service Center, the service brands that we repair there include Sennheiser, Christie, Blackmagic Design, Yamaha, DMB, Audio Technic, DB Technologies, Adlona, DVI Gear, QSC Systems specifically, Novastar, Radial Engineering. So our whole product portfolio gets repaired in-house. So we have access to all the technical and training from our agencies, and that gives us the ability to provide a repair service in-house. The topics we're going to cover today is tools you may require for basic maintenance, what we consider to be major minor services, what effect temperature and ventilation can have on equipment, what drastic influences dust can have on equipment. I see Kobus from Blue Array is here. He knows well about dust from Opikopi. Equipment run times, how important it is to keep logs of that. Firmware updates on equipment, when to do it, when not to do it. Do you really need to do it? Cable management and marking, how important that is for quick fault finding, and then covering a small bit of fault finding in a general aspect, a bit about wireless microphones and fault finding on that. Then some general maintenance tips, and then we're going to have a brief discussion about repair scheduling, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So the presentation or the webinar is about really maintenance basics. I'm not going to cover specific brands or a specific product. We can, if there's enough interest, or you can drop us some suggestions. You'll see the emails at the end of the presentation. You can drop us some suggestions on what you'd like to see covered. If there's something specific, then we can see what we can arrange around that. There's a group chat also open, so you can ask any questions there. Nathan will assist us in reading the questions, and there will also be a Q&A session at the end of this. So there'll be plenty of time for us to discuss whatever you would like to. So if we go to the first topic, we talk about the tools you may require for basic maintenance. So not all the tools I'm going to list is necessary or will be required. It depends on what your application is. So if we look at that first picture, it's just a general plug tester. So before you power up any piece of equipment, it's good to make sure the polarity is correct and the voltages are correct. So if you buy these cheap plug testers off the shelf from Hellerman, we're a Hellerman reseller, by the way. But that can show you that the polarity of the output from the main side is correct and that there's no stray voltages on the earth. So that's the easiest way to test something like that. And if you have other power distribution units, you can always just make a turnaround plug and just plug it in there to test that circuit down to a single. That's at the end for single phase. 3-phase, I'm not going to cover, but we can get into that later in the questions. Then probably the best thing to have for basic maintenance is a repair kit like this. That contains a set of screwdrivers, a set of Allen keys, anything that you might require to do basic maintenance. And some of these kits even include a multimeter, which is a plus if you don't have something like a cable tester down here. That is quite handy if you just want to do some continuity testing. Then we have a compressor here. So this is only like if you, in an extreme case, if you have a large venue maybe, or a house of worship where you have lots of moving lights. I wouldn't suggest using the compressor on its own. This is just to blow dust away. At least it must have a very good water trap. The issue with fast moving air is it can create a charge in the air, and that can, for sensitive electronics, it can damage those. So it's more for blowing out racks than actually blowing out components. There are some advanced. Simco Ion makes a deionizing gun that you can blow out electronics, but that's that you can connect to a compressor. But that's quite expensive. It also depends on your use case. Again, so if you have a large venue, that might be something worth investing in. Then, if you have any sort of cabling from an audio perspective, a soldering iron and some solder is always really, really handy. To get down to the a board repair level, I won't cover this in this webinar. We suggest that everything that needs to be repaired at a board level gets sent to the original, to the distributor where it was purchased, so they have a qualified team that can repair at board level. Then some IPA solvent. IPA solvent is good to clean off electronic components. Don't use IPA solvent on cables. It will definitely deteriorate the material that's on there. To clean off electronics, IPA solvent is very good to use. Then if you have any sort of network equipment, I know a lot of people do, if they're in larger venues, then a network test is always a good idea. You don't really require a network certification tester, just a cable tester that beeps out the connections between each point. So it's basically continuity testing. So a kit like this is nice to also have fault finding with a tone tester on the one side. You get cheaper ones than this, and all of them are really handy to have in your toolkit if you have network cabling in your setup. Then an alternative to the compressor is a blower style like this. Then you don't need to lug around something like that. And an alternative to the blower is also a compressed air canister that you can use to just blow away some dust. We can provide that. We also sell that. Then something that's really handy for surface cleaning and lens cleaning is lint-free wipes. So if you don't want to leave residue on a surface you've just cleaned, the lint-free wipes work really well for that. And then cable tester. So this also depends on what cabling you have, because you get different versions of the cable tester. Something like this from Summer Cabling will cover most of the general use things like video cables, USB cables, network cables. And this is just a continuity test. So you can flip it. Some of them cycle automatically through the pins, and some of them you have to manually cycle through the pins. But this gives you a good indication if you have a loose connection or a broken connection somewhere in your cabling. Some other tools that you might need is a small anti-static brush. If you do lots of maintenance with screws and unracking and racking, an electric screwdriver is always a good thing to have on hand. Again, if you use a compressor to blow stuff out, please just make sure you have a water trap installed. Otherwise, you get water all over your equipment. Then for tools you also might need, if you have projectors and you want to clean the lenses, there's no specific product that you need to buy, but in camera stores, they sell lens cleaning kits for normal camera lenses, and that works really well to clean projector lenses because they ship with a lint-free microfiber cloth, and that really helps not preserve the surface of the lens and not scratch that too much, because that can obviously affect the image. Okay, so that's the tools you might require. If we go on from there, we come to what we consider a major or minor service. A basic rule that we use is anything we need to open a panel of the piece of equipment that contains the power supply is considered a major service, because obviously it's dangerous to open any piece of equipment and the power supply is exposed, because if there's a loaded capacitor or something and you touch it, it can cause serious injury. So if you look at the pictures on the slide, there's a open Yamaha CL5. So even if you have to pop a cover like this, that's definitely considered major service. This is just an exploded view of a DMB D80 to see, so you can show. So if you have to go to this extent to open a amplifier in this respect, that is obviously also considered major service. And a speaker, from a speaker aspect of, if you have to do any like cabinet replacement or a cabinet is cracked, that will also be considered a major repair. Because normally, if you want to try and do this repairs yourself, most people don't have the test equipment to test the speaker to ensure that it conforms to the original manufacturer specification. And that's the advantage of sending something for that needs a major service to a service center, be it ours or be it any other service center, because they have to restore the equipment to the original manufacturer specification. And this is why major services we normally have to get in. From a minor service perspective, if you look at projectors, lamps and filters will be user replaceable. If you look at anything else, fuses, normally on most equipment there's an external fuse. If you have to replace the fuse, just look at the rating. But normally care instructions are inside of the user manual. So if those instructions are written inside the user manually, that's normally a minor service that the user can perform. So again, there's lots and lots of different gear that we can talk about. So we can be here for days if we talk about every single piece of gear individually. So I just want to cover it in broad strokes. The next thing we'll look at is temperature and ventilation. So the presence of dust and inadequate ventilation can severely damage electronic equipment. So just sticking a bunch of amps in a rack in a corner somewhere with no proper ventilation, or the back of it is against the wall, or the doors are closed and locked, can cause serious issues with the equipment. So the longevity might be affected because the components are rated for a certain temperature. I mean, they won't fail immediately, but over time, if they run out of spec for a long period of time, obviously the longevity of the product will be affected. Dust or bad ventilation could cause fans internally to ramp up to full speed continuously, which is not good all of the time. If the units are stored in racks and airflow is limited, then adding something like just an example of just a basic little 19-inch rack is normally they don't ship with fans, but they do ship with extractor holes at the top of them. So you can order these racks with fans pre-installed, or you can add your own extractors depending on what equipment you're installing in the rack and what heat dissipation requirements you have. And this will definitely, I know that it's more cleaning from a fan perspective, but it will definitely help in the long term with the reliability of the gear. So these are just something you can build into 19-inch racks. Flight cases also have the option of adding some ventilation, whether it be a perforated panel or something like an internal fan to help with the ventilation, especially if you do an outdoor gig or something and you're in direct sunlight. Having a gazebo is first prize, but it can definitely cause issues in the hot African sun if you have equipment exposed to direct sunlight in the middle of the summer. So ventilation is really important there. Another thing about ventilation, if you have a projector that's installed somewhere, if it's in a fixed position, always try and not install it close to an aircon duct or to a heater duct, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory for what can go wrong there. If a heater constantly blows on a projector that's already running hot, it can just exacerbate a problem. Then something I mentioned at the beginning is I think Kobus knows how dusty stuff can get, especially from an Opikopi perspective. So he has to blow half of the northwest out of his amplifiers when Opikopi was still running out of his amplifiers once he gets back from that. So if you look at the pictures here, the one on the right hand side, this little black, these blue-black spots you can see here, that's where the dust buildup got so bad that it caused a short on the actual PC board. And that is obviously bad. If you want to clean something like this out, I would suggest using an anti-static brush and a can of compressed air, or maybe sending something like this into a service center, because they have the right tools to properly blow it out, not to cause any more damage. But a blower will work well. The compressor, if you're doing your own maintenance from a quite a high level, a compressor will work also, but just brush it off of an anti-static brush, and maybe outside, because I don't know how happy somebody will be inside a church if you blow all this dust onto the carpet. Yeah, and again, if you use a compressor, please remember to add a proper water trap, because if you don't add a water trap and it's very humid where you are, the water will condense, and as soon as you open the compressor, there's a spurt of water that's going to fall all over the PC board, and that's really bad for the components. Then runtime of equipment. So runtime of equipment is important to keep track of, to schedule maintenance for the equipment that you have installed, or if it's a rental company, whether it's lamp hours on a projector or lamp hours on a moving light. So if you look at the pictures here, is this just an example of where in the menu structure of a moving light you would find the fixture use hours and the lamp use time. So the fixture use hours is, and normally in user manuals, they will state what time interval the fixture would need to go for a service at the authorized service center. And they will also state what lamp use time is acceptable and where the lamp needs to be swapped out. Most of the time also the lamp is a user swappable part. So if you get to that, reach that time limit, you can replace the lamp, and then there's normally a lamp time reset option. Then it will start counting from the beginning again. So you can, I know over time people build a inventory of gear, or they install a couple of more lights. But it's, as you add new gear, it's always good to try and log the run times as often as possible, so you can try and synchronize gear services, or you can spread them out over a couple of weeks. But it gives you a good way to plan, not to have all your gear out at once, or to at least maybe get some rental gear in if you need to send something for a service before it's too late and you have to scramble on the Friday afternoon to get it done and get some gear somewhere. On the right-hand picture, it's just a snapshot of the display from a Christie Boxer. So the lamp hours are here displayed directly on here, but if you have a projector in the user manual, somewhere in the menu there will be buried where the lamp hours are of that specific projector. There will also be a runtime on certain models. Not all of them will have it. Maybe Cluid can jump in here just on projector lamp hours. What happens to a projector lamp after 1,000 hours?
Yeah, so basically projectors, if we look at the average lifespan on a lamp, they are defined in the user manual. It will be anything between, say, 2,000 to 2,500 in the user manual, but it very rarely gets to those type of hours. From about 1,000 hours, we're probably sitting at about half brightness on most projectors. So your LX605 is literally about 3,000 lumens, which is your average boardroom type projector, instead of something for a little bit of a bigger venue.
Thank you, Cluid. This is why it's important to keep track of these things and where they are, because if on a Sunday morning you walk in and one of the projectors goes down because it's been on 1,200 hours, it's not just that the inconvenience of not having a projector for that Sunday. It's, if you keep monitoring these things, the experience also goes down. I mean, if you let it run past 1,000 hours, then nobody will be able to almost read the projectors or to see the image on the projector. The new technology that's coming to the fore now is obviously the laser phosphor projectors. Maybe Cluid can also just say one or two things about how the laser phosphor engine compares to a normal lamp-based product.
Yeah, so the laser phosphor stuff, as we have seen in our projects in Dubai and stuff like that, are very reliable units. Well, they're given a lifespan of 20,000 hours, the laser unit itself. So that should get most guys through a very long time. to be able to use them without having to do any replacements on the illumination side of it. And yeah, the laser units have been solid as anything in all of our installs that we have used them in.
Yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of Christie projectors running in the Dubai frame. Fluid's actually been there to go and do some maintenance. And again, it was not major services, was just, again, blowing out dust, because dust gets in everywhere, and those things have been really reliable. And I think from a service interval perspective, it depends also on the environment and what resources you have. If it's a house of worship and you have somebody that manages the equipment side, they can do general maintenance if it's a really dusty environment, at least once a quarter. If it's not so dusty and it's nice air conditioned and filtered, whatever, every 6 months to check filters and make sure that there's no dust buildup somewhere specifically in a rack. So I would say 3 months if it's a dusty environment, and 6 months if it's a okay-ish environment from a dust perspective for service intervals. And then we get to firmware updates. Everybody that's been involved in any sort of live event or piece of electronics has experienced a firmware update failure somewhere in their lives. I always ask myself the question, do I really need to do a firmware update? Stuff to consider before doing a firmware update is you must consider the correct time to do a firmware update of any device. If it's an amplifier, projector, console, a Dante audio device somewhere on network, a network switch, don't do it the day before the gig or the morning before the gig. Give yourself some breathing room that if something goes wrong, then at least you know you have a backup plan if something goes wrong with that piece of equipment. And the other question is, do you really need to do the firmware update? It doesn't mean that if a firmware update is released, you need to do that firmware update. The important stuff to read through is the release notes and what features are added with that firmware update. Because if you don't require the features that a new firmware update brings, and the piece of equipment is mission critical and it's been running stable for a year, then I won't touch it, because if it's not broken, don't fix it. So I would only do a firmware update if I require that new firmware version. If you think of the firmware that Yamaha releases for the consoles, probably most console manufacturers, there's quite a lot of feature updates that you would need. So that would be necessary, but that you would like to use, but don't do it the morning before the gig, because if you break it, then how would you get around that? And again, important to read the release notes of any firmware update and check on the download page where you download the firmware update. There's normally some notes around incremental steps. So if the new version is firmware version 4, say for instance on a Yamaha Rio or something, and your Rio is only on version 1, there will definitely be some incremental steps you have to take, because there's been massive changes in the structure of how the firmware is deployed from 1 to 4. So that's very important to check, because if you break the unit, you're going to have to send it in, can cause some real issues for you. If you do firmware updates on any device, if it's possible, make sure try and get the unit onto a UPS, because if the power fails halfway during a firmware update, that can also break the unit. If you don't have a UPS, in South Africa, we have something called load shedding, so make sure that you're not going to do it 5 minutes before the load shedding is scheduled. Then we'll get to cable management and marking. So I'm just showing off some work here from Stage Audio Works. This is amplifiers we installed into a project. So if you look at this first picture on the left-hand side, you can see every single cable is marked, and there's quite a bit of space, and they're properly out of the way, and the power distribution sits at the bottom, is distributed up. So this rack is not complete yet, but if you have an issue during a live show, or you quickly want to find an issue, or quickly you want to rip something out of a rack that needs quick replacement, Having it organized in this way makes a massive difference how quickly you can find the fault and get back up and running. So you see all the avios have been marked. I don't think the amplifiers have marked in yet, but each circuit on the power distribution unit will be marked to which amplifier it's going. The amplifier name is printed in a label on the outside with its IP address. And this is just an example for racking, but I mean, if you do cabling on a semi-permanent truss installation in a venue, it's always good to have those cables marked as well. The units marked. Having a table of IP addresses, if the units use IP addresses, keep track of each unit's name and its IP address so you can quickly access and know where the units are and identify them really quickly, because it's about how quickly you can get the units back up and running without causing too much pain for yourself. And I think marking and cable management is a big part of that. You'll also see I think there's a 1U space between each one of these amplifiers. With the amplifiers that we're using here is not really necessary, but again, it's a lot easier for cable management if you have space at the back. Then not everything is as compressed. I know sometimes it's really difficult if you have not a lot of space, but you have a lot of kit in a more compact rack than this. But then you can always ask a professional to help with the rack wiring. I know a couple of guys who can do that really well, so you can just always send us an email. And then we go to fault finding. Fault finding is very difficult in some aspects. Again, it depends on what environment you're in, what equipment you're working with, if you know the layout, if you've kept proper track of how everything is installed and connected. So, but we're just going to cover some basic things. Everybody who's ever had a problem on a live gig would understand, or from an engineering aspect will understand this little picture I have here on the right-hand side. Fault finding steps are normally in the user manual. I know a cable doesn't have a user manual, but we'll get to that now. But if you have a mixer or a microphone, most electronic equipment comes with a user manual. Inside, normally at the back of that would be a troubleshooting guide, and it's listed in steps, and it will describe the fault and what the solution is. So in most equipment, if you follow that troubleshooting guide and you still can't fix the problem, then you would call a professional or send the unit in for a service to the authorized dealer or the authorized repair center, whatever product it may be. Read the manual first. It will really help if you're struggling with troubleshooting and fault finding. If we get to cables, you'll see on the left-hand side, this picture here. This is in the back of most cable suppliers. This is from the Sommer cable catalog, some of the last pages. It's just a general pinout of specific cables, like a balanced and unbalanced microphone cable, some turnaround cables, insert stereo cables. This guide will help you if you have a cable tester on hand to make sure those pinouts are correct. The polarity on cables are obviously really important. So a guide like this Sommer document will help tremendously in the pinouts. Some user manuals also have pinouts for if there's specific cables that needs to be used with a piece of equipment. If we look at mixers or consoles, if you fault finding that, this is a block diagram of a mixer. So if you want to follow the signal path and fault find a specific part, this is very handy if you want to see if a signal should be routed to somewhere and you're not getting any output or input from a specific location. Faulty faders on mixers and console will always make a scratching noise. If you have a digital console, you'll experience this weird jump in level if a fader is on the way out. So lots of digital consoles have built-in testing for the faders and what issues it can, fader calibration and fader aging testing, that you can run on the console, and it will highlight which fader might be suspect. then you can send the unit in and say, okay, or you can get a quote and send the unit in, and we can replace faders, or any authorized service center for any of those manufacturers of the console can replace the faders for you. Dust is a killer for faders, like a real killer. So most consoles ship with a dust cover. Whenever the console is not in use, just put the dust cover on. It will really extend the life of the faders by quite a bit. If we look at microphones, if you have an issue with a wireless microphone, let's say it's a handheld, normally people in venues have more than one microphone if they have a handheld. If it's the same brand, you can always just, the first thing to normally try is just swap the capsules between the two handhelds. On Sennheiser specifically, if the capsule is faulty, the handheld will remain in the mute state. So if you swap the capsule, it's a quick way to check if it's the capsule or not. There's not much else you can check from a user perspective on the handheld itself. Just batteries is also really important. If the batteries are running low, that can cause issues. Fault finding on speakers, if it's a passive speaker, use what's at your disposal. Normally, if people have one speaker, they have another. Put the speakers next to each other and see and listen to them. You can compare the two. It just gives you an indication of what might be wrong. It doesn't mean you can swap out the driver. If you kit it out to swap the driver, then you know how to do it. Once you confirm the fault, it's the speaker is faulty, then you can send that in for a service. Powered speakers, again, if you have something to compare it to, swap the cable maybe first. If you think it's the speaker, check all the cabling is right, and then confirm the fault that it is the speaker, and then you can send it. And if there's, again, on speakers, if there's user replaceable parts or user maintainable parts, it will be listed in the user manual. So reading the manual of every piece of gear. I know when you get a new piece of gear, you just rip it out of the box and you just want to plug it in and it must go. But it's definitely worth reading through the user manual and just checking some maintenance steps and some what parts are user replaceable. Fault finding on projectors. Normally projectors, if something goes wrong, it can't display anything because it uses the projected image to display errors. So on most projectors, there are LEDs that will indicate faults. These will vary drastically from manufacturer to manufacturer and even from model to model. Again, these will be listed in the user manual. Some quick fault finding tips on projectors. Some projectors filter doors have little sensor buttons. So sometimes you might not have, if you replace the filter, sometimes you didn't clip the filter in properly. So just making sure you do those type of things properly when you replace a filter can help in avoiding some errors there. Then every piece of equipment that we use except cables need mains power from somewhere. So that's where that plug test I showed in the beginning came in. If that plug test picks up an error in the mains wiring, there's not much you can do. You have to get a qualified person in to check the supply because it can cause real havoc between various on any piece of equipment. If you have a three-phase supply and something goes wrong and the neutral drops, it can cause real issues. So it's important to test the mains power before you plug anything into the circuit. And if there's an issue, a qualified person would have to look at that. And just some general fault finding tips. If the unit has an external power supply, if like a small analog console or even a computer screen, some of them have an external power supply. Make sure that rating on that power supply is correct for the unit you're connecting it to. Those specifications will also be in the user manual, and the specifications of small desktop power supplies are normally written on the side of them. Make sure you're using the correct power supply for the correct unit. One thing also that can cause lots of issues are cheap power strips that we buy from builders warehouse, wherever. I've been to plenty of gig where somebody forgot the multiplex. So if somebody just runs to builders and buys, for the short term that can work, but there's a lot more rugged solutions out there than a plastic, because people step on them and they break. the switches conk out. So investing in some real nice hardcore rugged power distribution units. I think there's a company called Stage Plus that does some power distribution units. You should go check them out. If you have any questions, just drop them a mail. And then again, like I said, use what's at your disposal. If you have a unit a working unit to compare to something, use that. Yeah, you're going to have to look at your surroundings and how you kitted yourself out. I think building experience in fault finding is being exposed to situations where things go really wrong. So it's a skill set you build over time, but with the guidance from user manuals, with troubleshooting guides, you can sort out most of the issues you will encounter. And if not, we can always support. Let's go to the next topic, which is wireless. So I'm not going to go in depth into the wireless. It's just some general tips on the wireless. Stage AudioWorks is also the Sennheiser authorized service center is at the Stage AudioWorks headquarters. So we receive a lot of repairs where there's not really anything wrong with the microphones. So this will just be a basic guide and quick stuff to check before you send the unit in. So just some general tips and guidelines is if you have body pack antennas, when a body pack antenna touches the skin of a person, it can lose up to 15 dB in RF transmission. So the easiest way to avoid that is you can use some aquarium tube that you cut off and you stick over the antenna. Don't use gaffer tape because I know gaffer tape is the thing we have handy all the time. And if you use a piece of aquarium tube and you just pull it over the body pack antenna, that will also keep it a bit more straight and it will avoid contact with the body. It depends obviously where the body pack is. Basics is always ensure line of sight where possible. If the performer or the presenter, whoever has two packs, one in ear and one receiver, make sure they're not next to each other. They must be trying to use the body as a spacing between the two. Even if it's two or more body packs, say you have a theater production running and you have a pack on the person, the packs mustn't be next to each other because you'll get intermodulation. Try and move them away from each other. Cabling is also very important because the most of the cable that ships with microphones and that most people sell are RG58 cable. It's 50 ohm impedance cable, and RG58 is good for maybe 5 meters if you want to extend to antennas. If anything over that, I would suggest running LMR 400 or RG213 low loss cable. If you're having frequency issues with microphones, I know Sennheiser specifically has a scan option. So if you have one or two RF channels doing a scan on the unit itself, it would select the best frequency available that's intermodulation free. So just checking that before thinking the belt pack is broken, just check that there's no interference on the frequency, and the scan on the unit will normally help with that. If you're using a whip antenna on receivers and transmitters, don't put them together. If you have a rack of receivers and transmitters, don't put the antennas next to each other. Give them 2U space between transmitters and receivers if you have in-ears and then wireless microphones. And don't put the antennas at the back together. To at least try and give them some space between them, maybe to the top of the bottom of the rack. If you have external antennas, like directional antennas, like the big paddles that everybody sees everywhere, if you have transmitter antennas and receiver antennas, also always make sure the transmitter antennas are in front of the receiver antennas. Otherwise, the transmitters will saturate the receiver antennas that's in front of them, can cause issues. Just some general maintenance tips. The picture I have here is care and cleaning instructions that come with Sennheiser MKE1. A lot of manufacturers also releases documentation like this. So don't just use chemicals that you don't know will properly work. Check if the manufacturer has a document like this This can save you a lot of headache that maybe use a chemical that will degrade the cable or break the capsule or something like that. So just consult the manufacturer user manual for some of those things. Let's cover some maintenance tips on cables. Yeah, don't use alcohol-based solvent to clean mic cables. This will compromise the cable integrity over time. Just use a damp cloth to wipe it down. Again, cables can get trampled and beaten on stage over a long period of time. So just a damp cloth to wipe them down. Always apply a small bit of strain relief on the end of a cable. So if you plug a cable in somewhere, make sure the cable is long enough so there's some slack for some strain relief. Don't use a cable where it just makes the length of where you're trying to plug it in. If the cable is not properly strain relieved, will put tension on the solder points. If that cable is mission critical and it fails, there's nothing you can do about it. Something that's really important is if you do replace any parts that's listed in a user manual, let's take lamps and filters on projectors, because this is where we've seen it the most, is use original manufacturer parts. We've seen a lot of fake lamps that has been sold and been installed by the user. Then that lamp explodes inside the projector. The projector was still under warranty, and that warranty is now void because the lamp was not an original manufacturer lamp. If it's something catastrophic happens to a lamp and it was from the original manufacturer, they would still cover the warranty, because that can cause not just the lamp to explode, but the other damaging, the glass that flies everywhere inside the projector, the lamp driver. I mean, this goes for almost every piece of equipment. As far as you possibly can, try and use original manufacturer parts. It just helps with the warranty and the support afterwards. Cleaning speaker grills and drivers. So if you have a cone driver, a grill is normally easily to take off. You'll also be cleaning instructions in most unit manuals, but you can take the speaker grill off, wipe that down with a damp cloth, and if you have a driver, you can wipe it down with just a damp cloth, not wet, and let it dry afterwards. If you have a high frequency driver, normally as a dome tweeter, don't clean that. If you deform that dome in any way, shape, or form, there's no turning back. You have to replace it. Projector lens cleaning. Again, I think I said this earlier, but camera shops will sell a nice lens cleaning kit for camera lenses, and that's the perfect thing to clean lenses with. Let's talk about repair scheduling. So this is almost the same approach as the firmware updates. I need to do it in time, not leave it for the last minute. So for us to provide, or any repair center for that fact, need to provide quick turnaround times, we urge scheduling. I know it's not always possible. If something goes wrong and, I don't know, a power surge or something, I see Andy's in the chat. He knows about lightning and power surges pretty well, I think, at this stage. We'll discuss that a bit later in the Q&A. But scheduling a repair, it all comes together with tracking the runtime of the equipment you're using. Because if you track that runtime, you can schedule repairs to go in without having extensive downtime. If you send a unit in for repairs, we will try and provide a loan unit, depending if one is available. It's not always possible, but again, if you're scheduling repairs, at least there's some time frame where we can maybe you can get a rental one in for the 3 or 4 days that the unit is in. It also gives, so Cluid is the service manager, so he'll sort you out. But if we can schedule a repair, the unit comes in on a day and we know it's an urgent query, that we can assess it the same day and give feedback on the same day and get the quote out to you as soon as possible. That maybe it's a fault you can live with for one more weekend if we don't have the parts. So we can assess it, send it, you can collect the unit again, and you can use the unit, and then once the parts arrive, you can bring the unit back and we can do the repair. So I think it's also about communication. Cluid is there, Tabo is there for our service center specifically now. So communication to them is key. And I think obviously there's a lot of hours of worship people in this chat. If I quickly look at that, communicating from the volunteers back to whoever's responsible for maintaining the gear is important. So the volunteers shouldn't be scared to say, "I broke this," on the Sunday evening, so that the first thing in the morning or the first thing on a Tuesday morning, people can get in contact with the relevant people. If it's a guitar, if it's a keyboard, anything. If it's only reported on the Friday and the day before the service, you realize, okay, my guitar amp is broken, there's not much you can do about that. The sooner we can get the unit in and assessed, the better for you, and the quicker we can make a plan or put you in contact with somebody that has rental gear available, to help out. It was really broad strokes. I tried to cover as much as possible, but if you have any suggestions on something specific you would like to see, if somebody has any specific questions, Marnus, if you open a speaker, will it void its warranty? It depends. If you open the grill, probably not. If you just want to clean the speaker out, it depends on brand as well. If you crack the amplifier module open and it blows up and you attempt to repair and something goes wrong, normally when you send that speaker back in for repairs and it's under warranty, the technician can see somebody worked on the PC board, and that company, if it be us or somebody else, will have track of that speaker. So you can see something was done to the speaker in its warranty period. So I think if anything goes wrong in a warranty period of any piece of equipment, again, it depends from manufacturer to manufacturer, but the easiest answer is if it's in warranty and something is wrong, immediately send it back, because then the responsibility goes back to the supplier to make that call. What is a good cable label practice? Is there a standard that is used? Well, it depends what you're using the cables for. So if it's a data, if it's wiring a data center, then absolutely there are some, can't remember the specific standards, but there are standards to adhere to. But the way we mark cables is, if we do an installation, is our draftsman will come up with a cable schematic, and each cable will have a number, and that number will go onto the cable. But then you have a schematic to reference it to. If you don't have that, you can just use numbers and different numbers for every cable type. So, audio cable can go from 001 to 900. If you don't have a lot of cables, you can always use color codes as well. So it's just about identifying where this cable plugs into and where the other end is plugged into very quickly, so you can trace that. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Like to show you a schematic, maybe seeing as we have the people from Mauritius. So this is a basic schematic that we're using on a project. These are all the different units that will have the same schematic. The schematic at the bottom here, these are the duplicates of the schematic in the installation. So just close here. So we will have the equipment just listed with what connector. Then we will have a cable and the cable number connected, associated with that cable. So if you have labels like that on the cables and you have the schematic, they are really easy to trace, because if you have a PDF open like this, you can find the cable number without any issues. And then marking each like network patch panel, and every cable like this makes life a lot easier in the long run. Are there any other questions? When a projector starts to give a purple hue, what could be the issue? Fluid?
So depending on what model of the projector it is, but on most cases, if we see a purple hue, it's normally dirt that starts to build up on one of the LCD panels. A lot of these can be cleaned. If you can send me the model number and stuff like that, I can have a look at it for you and see what I can do.
Brilliant, thank you.
How's it, guys?
Hello, Quibus.
Hello. Just a quick question. What is the best
Yes.
way to look after your fibers, especially the connectors, on cleaning them as well?
Cleaning, you get, depending on the connector type itself, if it's LC, SC, or ST, you can buy something called a one-click cleaner. It looks like a pen, and you can get them for various types of connectors. So it just cleans and polishes the surface of the ferrule of the fiber. So, but I mean, that doesn't help if somebody's stepping on the connector and ripping it off. I think the best way we've seen is to just make sure the cable is rolled properly. If you roll out an entire fiber cable and you have it on a drum and you start rolling that up, before you roll the entire cable onto the drum, bring the connectors closer to the drum instead of just rolling the cable and the connector on the other side is flopping around. I haven't really found an easy way to add or some protection over the connectors themselves. Maybe there's something we can look into to see if you have a bare connector, if it's LC, SC, or ST. I think it's also about speaking to whoever is rolling up the cable, to the crew. I mean, you get more rugged solutions, but they can be very costly. Also having maybe a door on the side of the reel instead of having the cable hanging out of the side of the reel with a mid coupler, then you can just buy the external patch cables separately, and those are cheap because those are just off the shelf. It's like they're $100 instead of replacing connectors on a rugged patch lead. You just replace the entire cable because the connectors on a rugged patch lead can cost up to $280 to replace.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Could I repeat what I said about the positioning of the tenors of the wireless system? Okay, so the basics, what I said is if you have a wireless, if you have in one rack, one flight case rack, if you have a transmitter for in-ears and a receiver for a microphone, try and separate them as far as you can, maybe with 2U of rack space, so that the antennas are separated so there's no interference with or as minimal interference as possible with each other. And if you have external antennas like paddles, if you backstage and you're facing the stage, put the transmitter antennas in front of the receiver antennas. Because if it's the other way around, the transmitter antennas will transmit over the receiver antennas, and that can cause an issue of oversaturation of the receiver side. I think that's it then. Thank you, everybody.